Perhaps the best known of all the digital signal processing methods is the Fourier transform. That's a method of breaking down an arbitrary signal into a series of component frequencies, a so-called frequency spectrum. Joseph Fourier was a contemporary and a scientific advisor to Napoleon. He's best known and still relevant today for the Fourier transform, in which he showed that any signal can be decomposed into a series of sine waves or sinusoids. At the top of this image, we have the same sine wave that we saw earlier from the signal generator. At the bottom, we've used the Fourier transform to turn that into a frequency spectrum. There's only a single line in the spectrum because there was only a single sine wave in the input. If I change the amplitude of the input, then the amplitude of the line in the spectrum changes proportionally. If I now change the frequency of the input, then the position of the line in the spectrum changes. Higher frequencies, the line moves to the right. Lower frequencies, the line would move to the left. Now I'll change the input to a square wave, and you'll see that the frequency spectrum is suggesting that this square wave is composed of a series of sinusoids at various frequencies and amplitudes. You may remember from the lecture on filters that sine waves are in some sense a fundamental wave shape. They crop up here and there and everywhere in nature. Fourier's great insight was to show that in fact any waveform, any complex waveform, can be considered as the sum of a series of sine waves. So in that sense, they are mathematically a fundamental wave shape, as well as occurring very frequently in nature. On the right side of the screen now, we'll show how we can build up that square wave from a series of sinusoids or sine waves. I'll select the first line in the frequency spectrum. The red line shows what the corresponding sine wave looks like. At the moment, it's only a crude approximation to the square wave that we're aiming for. If I add in the second frequency component, you can see it fills in a few of the rough edges and looks a little more like the square wave. I continue adding the third, fourth, and fifth components, and with each one, we get closer and closer to the input square wave. Until, with the addition of the final sinusoid, we get back to the square wave input. Composing a square wave out of lots of simpler wave shapes, sine waves in this case, is a reasonably well repeated demonstration, and I believe that most people can accept intuitively that it's possible to make complex regular wave shapes, like a square wave, by adding together lots of simpler waves, such as a sine wave. Where I and a lot of other people have the difficulty is understanding how you can make an arbitrary, non-repeating waveform by adding together lots of simpler, repeating wave shapes. So that's where we're going to need Because this waveform is extremely complex, we're going to freeze a portion of it and use that as our target for constructing out of sine waves.
like I lost my way. So no loose ends, nothing to see me down. How are we going to work this out?
I've taken a snapshot of a suitably complicated looking part of the signal waveform, and at the bottom of the screen, the frequency spectrum shows how that has been decomposed by the Fourier transform into a series of sine waves. So now to start building it back up towards the original signal waveform. We selected the first few lines in the spectrum, and you can see that the composite of those is only a very crude approximation to the original waveform.
Picture I'm a dreamer, I'll take you deeper down to the sleepy glow.
But as we add in more and more lines from the spectrum, we get closer and closer to the original waveform.
What are we going to do? We go down. All the sake of selflessness, all we lost
And sure enough, when we add back all the lines in the spectrum, then we will get back to exactly the waveform that we started from.
what are we going to do?
I can honestly say it never ceases to amaze me to see that happen. It's very difficult to believe. It was a great piece of insight from Fourier, and it wouldn't be an overestimation to say that was one of the most important pieces of mathematics in the last 500 years.